Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 55 of the Nurtured by Nature podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined in conversation by Christopher Brown, author of the recently released book, A Natural History of Empty Lots, Field Notes from Urban Edgelands, Back Alleys, and Other Wild Places. In this captivating conversation, Chris's lyrical descriptions take us on a beautiful journey as we join him in stepping off the pavement into a world where nature has adapted to thrive in the most unlikely of environments at the heart of our urbanised landscapes. He describes his ambitious plan to create a home for his family on an industrialised wasteland where he has miraculously balanced their own needs in a way that also allows him to actively seek to share his space with other species. Chris reminds us that rewilding doesn't require the depopulation of humans, and that there is an intrinsic link between the social and economic injustices in our world and the damaged relationship we have with the natural world and the land we live on. But he also encourages us to remember that nature has an incredible ability to respond to the opportunities we make for her, and that we don't have to wait for global institutions to take the lead. We ourselves can be the catalysts for change in remaking a new way of living in the world. Welcome, Chris, and thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of the Nurtured by Nature podcast. I've just finished reading your fantastic book, which has just been released, A Natural History of Empty Lots. So I'm sure we're going to have lots of opportunity to discuss that and some of the themes from your book. But just to get started, I always ask my guests to share their nature story, which is quite apt for you because actually your book is your nature story. So if you can just pick out a little sort of place to start, a fond memory, something, an experience of nature that you've had in your life that will get us going, and that would be lovely.
Sure, that'd be great. Thanks so much, Fiona. I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, which is like the most quintessentially sort of Pleasantville kind of American place you could imagine. It's a small city and a very rural, predominantly agricultural region, the kind of the Corn Belt. The prairie between the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers that once was a verdant rolling prairie and now it's just farm corns and soybeans growing with the occasional hog feedlot as far as the eye can see. And so you grow up on a landscape like that, and you go out into the country with your family as a kid, and sort of everything is green, but you sort of realize, without even having the vocabulary to think about it or talk about it, that nothing is alive, right?
Yeah, no.
Especially in an era of pesticides and herbicides. And so I found as a kid that there was more wild nature to be experienced in the city. And and we when I was like in the third grade, which for is, I don't know, 8, 9 years old, no, a little younger, 7, 8 years old, we moved to a little house that was kind of next to a pocket of urban woods.
Oh,
And I
nice.
found that, I just naturally had a gravitation to go down into that place and to sort of sneak around and see what I could find and what little wildlife encounters I could find, and just to get away from the pavement into those places. And from that, I learned, like, whenever I would migrate around town, even if I was going to the mall or going to some corporate office building, that there were always these little pockets, and you could sneak around back and find them and find some way to get in there, sometimes maybe by jumping a fence, but usually by just going where one was free to go. And then I forgot about it until I was an adult and a dad of a little boy myself. And I was like, oh yeah, instead of driving for 3 hours, we can try to do that. So I sort of rediscovered it. And in a way, that's what the book's about, is how, a nature story that's about how to relive on fresh new terms our childhood nature
Yeah.
stories as adults, you
Yeah, I
know?
think I think that's really, it's quite something that I quite often talk about, is trying to sort of refine that like natural curiosity that we would have had in childhood, where we have this sort of amazing awe and wonder for the world around us. And, sort of adult happens to us and life happens
Right.
to us, and we sort of like, our world gets smaller and smaller, and it's amazing. And I think quite often, like in your book, your son's influence was quite a key theme, wasn't it? Of how you started to rediscover that love of nature that I guess we all have pretty much inherently in childhood.
Yeah, but it's funny, I'm just thinking, what children really give us, sort of very counterintuitively, when it comes to experiencing nature, is the gift of time to appreciate nature. Because as adults in a modern urban society, where we all, presumably most of us, have to, are busy with work and with keep making ends meet and with
Yeah,
attending to domestic life, and just we feel sort of time starved, right?
yeah,
And enjoying nature really takes little chunks, hopefully bigger
yeah,
chunks of time to
yeah.
experience it, and certainly to be out there kind of waiting for serendipity of a wildlife encounter to happen takes a lot of time. And kids give us, what my son gave me in a way was like, oh, it's the weekend. I'm supposed to watch him. I'm going to relieve my partner. And oh, let's go do something fun. Let's go out in nature. And he loved nature. He had that kind of intrinsic child's curiosity about what was out there, maybe in a healthier way than me, even. And so, yeah, that gift of time that children give us to go out there and then to see the world through their eyes, and like, oh yeah, you're right, I had forgotten the
Yeah.
novelty of just like, oh look, those like weird green parakeets that are like
Yeah.
imported from Argentina and are now living in the light towers behind our house by the playing fields, just things like that.
Yeah, I love your book, that you kind of you take us along on this amazing story of like your journey through this urban landscape. And I mean, I would say in the way that most people think I'm quite lucky because I've been in a rural environment, but it's actually, like you said, a lot of like our rural areas, both in the UK and the US, actually are really lacking in like biodiversity and wildlife, because they are predominantly like quite heavily commercially farmed. And it is just really fascinating to see, like, follow your story through an urban landscape which is unfamiliar for me, and just finding all of these amazing pockets of wildlife, and how, I guess, how wildlife is so adaptable. I think that's a big theme in your book, is how nature has adapted to the spaces that it's found, and that have been often unintentionally left, that it has recolonized, really, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting to see, and I'll say it's funny, you talk about how exotic the landscape I described seems to you. And one of my inspirations for the book was a very, very English book, which is Richard Maybe's The Unofficial Countryside from 1973, which sort of does that in the context of like post-war peripheral London, and seeing this sort of bountiful wildlife. But the landscape I describe is a lot more Anthropocene and maybe brutalized than what he describes. He's
Yeah,
talking about, sort of where the kind of suburban England, at the outskirts of the great city, sort of, mingles with the countryside or dissolves into the countryside. Here we have a landscape of, kind of heavy industry,
yeah,
petrochemical infrastructure, as you would imagine Texas. You think of kind of imagining, the
yeah,
refineries around Houston. We've all seen images of those over the years, and with the flare-offs that look like some kind of modern industrial version of Mordor or something, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um, but interestingly, part of the reason that infrastructure is there because it's on this, kind of swampy wetland landscape of the Gulf Coast of Texas that's rich with petrochemicals in the
yeah,
subsurface,
yeah,
and that industrial activity has a counterintuitive, I don't know if I want to use the word benefit, but a counterintuitive sort of opportunity it creates, to provide space for wildlife and for wild other, for wild plants by keeping heavier human activity out, even if at times it pollutes it. And so, yeah, and you see the crazy things that these animals do to adapt to the landscape. Studies have been done about raccoons, this, procyon that's, unique to the North American landscape, that the urban raccoons have rapidly adapted to be much more intelligent than their country
Yeah.
cousins because they have to solve all these problems, like how do you open a trash bin that's been secured with, bungee cords or whatever.
Yeah.
Or how, when I was a little kid, in like the 70s, there were a lot of stray dogs in American cities before animal control,
Okay.
especially in, certain neighborhoods, right? It was very common that, dogs would be allowed to roam loose and they would kind of patrol the alleys and whatnot. And as animal control got better at sort of controlling, stray dogs and limiting that population, coyotes and foxes to a lesser extent, but especially coyotes have really kind of moved in from rural areas to populate the cities, to where you have, like, in downtown Chicago, one of the most, intensely urban of American cities, you have hundreds of coyotes out
Oh,
prowling every night, and they're not scavenging.
no.
They're like hunting smaller mammalian life that's out, living off our trash or whatever. The most mind-blowing things I've seen are little in the little details, like where we live on this sort of rehabilitated brownfield lot behind a bunch of factories in a light industrial neighborhood that's also on the other side about some urban woods and the riparian corridor of an urban river. Um, we have these northern cardinals, this beautiful
Oh,
red
wow.
kind of crested bird that
Yeah.
they're kind of a commonplace bird in the American landscape, but and especially so on our lot. And what I found, we put a green roof on our house,
Yeah.
basically, which we built in the ditch from removing this old petroleum pipeline that was bisecting the lot when I found it. And on the green roof, we sort of went for this like post-apocalyptic rewilded aesthetic. And so we have like these native vines are dangling down the roof over the windows. And the cardinals quickly figured out, oh, like if I build my nest here in these robust native vines that are quite secure anchoring structures, I've got the protection of these windows and the steel. The snakes can't get down
Yeah.
to where I am. And it's a good spot. And then you look at the nests when they eventually fall to the ground a couple of seasons after they've been built, and you see that the cardinals are using industrial packaging
Oh, yeah,
materials they've harvested.
I read that in
They've
your book. It
harvested
was
from these. Yeah,
fascinating. It was like, it was incredible. And they were making use of all of these, what sort of, I guess almost litter really, wasn't it? That you would think of.
trash. Yeah,
Yeah.
trash. I mean, it's like plastic wrappers from, food from the convenience store,
Yeah.
like clear plastic, and like plastic bags and that open cell foam that's used to insulate hard objects, being
Yeah.
shipped, inside cardboard boxes. And then I started researching about other bird adaptations to urban materials, and it's astonishing. Like in Mexico City, the house finches and English sparrows, as we call them over here. They're invasive birds over here, but they use like cigarette butts, and they like open the
Oh,
cigarette
wow.
butts, and they get the like fibers out. And there's been a study of like whether that's toxic to the fledglings.
Yeah.
But and then in the Low Countries, and like in Holland and in the Netherlands and in Belgium, birds, the corvids, crows, and
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
magpies are harvesting these anti-bird spikes
Oh, wow.
that they're like put up to keep the birds from nesting. They figured out how to then they're like glue it on, and they figured out how to rip them off and then like line their nests so it looks like, what's that Swiss artist who did the Alien movies, that H.R. Giger. It looks
Yeah.
like an H.R. Giger version of a bird's nest. And it's
Yeah.
like it's sort of horrifying in a way, and it's like evidence of the cyborg mess we've made of the world, but it's also really beautiful and affirming as in the evidence it provides of nature's resilience and ability to adapt with what we provided.
Yeah, I think that's what's really beautiful about your book is that I mean I know towards the end you look at like ways that we can, sort of move forward as a society, and there is obviously this big sort of rewilding movement, but one of the things you say is about that rewilding doesn't have to mean like depopulation of people, like we need to find this way that we can live alongside nature, and that's exactly what you did with building your house, wasn't it? You wanted a home that, the house itself and the land around it, that was also a home for other species, not just yourself and your wife and your family. And it's really fascinating to read your book and your whole story. But yeah, if you just wanted to share a little bit more about the actual house you built and the lot that you found, because it's really fantastic, all of the wildlife that kind of came to live with you that you've adapted to as well.
Yeah, so I talked earlier about being a young dad, going out and exploring these wild urban spaces with my son and having all kinds of cool experiences, coyotes just walking behind the train station and huge uh rare woodpeckers in the near the spillway of the dam, and deer skulls next to Budweiser cans back behind some pumping station. And so I found this lot, and it was when I found myself, at the onset of middle age, newly bachelored, and a half-time single dad, and looking for a place to live more permanently than the apartment I was renting downtown. And so I started looking around I was like, well, maybe there's a way to live in one of these kinds of spaces,
Yeah.
right? Like, why not? And so I started looking around, and it was really the peak of or the nadir, one should say, of the financial crisis. And so it was, the land values were depressed, but it was also hard to borrow money. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
but I found this crazy lot, this industrial lot with the petroleum pipeline on it, complete with this like steel 6 foot by 6 foot steel box right in the middle of the lot that had a wheel like the you'd find on the hatch of a ship,
Oh,
that
wow.
was to access the pipeline. But also, my inner, as the boy who had grown up reading porthole fantasies, as we like to call them, kind of lion, witch, and wardrobe kinds of
Yeah.
stories. I was like, oh, I wonder where that will take me if I open it up, but it was locked. Um, and so I had this crazy idea. I found, and a lot, it was more than the pipeline. It was just like covered in trash. I mean, there was all this, it had been open and kind of at the edge of town. And so people, were tearing down buildings and tearing up streets to make new ones. And they would
Yeah.
just
Dumping.
dump truckloads of concrete. It was, I
Yeah.
call it the Garden of Rebar back in there. And there was like an old tire that was kind of half emerged from the soil, and inside it had this incredible hive of Africanized honeybees.
Oh,
Right,
wow.
there was an old Ford pickup truck down at the bottom of the hill that was sort of half embedded in the ground, sticking up, pointing at the sky like the old Eldorados at the Cadillac Ranch in Amarillo, not too far from here. And so, anyway, so I saw this, and it was like, the kind of site that some, urban planner or chamber of commerce type would cringe at the very existence of such a place in their beautiful growth-oriented city.
Yeah.
This zone of extreme entropy, and I was like, oh, what a cool place! We could make like a little house here. And so I negotiated with the oil company to take out their pipeline, which had already been abandoned, and found some young, hungry architects to entertain my kind of
Crazy
crazy,
idea.
like, yeah, science fiction writer kind of ideas to build a house, like, that looks as much like a post-apocalyptic bunker as possible, right? Sort of fully rewilded, after us kind of,
Yeah.
redoubt. And so, and these guys, it was Thomas Bercy and Calvin Chen, these gifted architects, and they got what I was doing. I'm like sending them, J.G. Ballard books and essays about, bunkers of the Normandy coast and Tacita Dean movies and like all this kind of crazy stuff. And they got it. And so we came up with this design that really is about trying to have a house that actively seeks to share the space of the human habitat, of the human domus, with
Yeah.
other life. And which was, the core crazy conceit I had. And so uh, the house is basically built, as I said, in the ditch where the pipeline was. It's buried under, 8 inches of topsoil in a form that's almost like an origami sheet made folded from the earth, from like the
Oh,
skin
wow.
of the earth. That's sort of the aesthetic of it. And we planted it. We had friends at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center who are experts in helping to design green roofs that can handle the hot and dry Texas climate. And the answer is, well, you plant it with a biodiverse array of native grasses from
Yeah.
the prairie ecosystems that were here before. And so we have this living roof that's like biodiverse and wild. And almost immediately when we got it going, it's just like the other life came, the insect life and the bird life and the lizards and the snakes and the small mammals. And the house is divided in two. It's like the size of a 2-bedroom apartment, basically, like 1,200 square feet. To go from one room to the other, you have to walk outside,
Oh, wow.
which is a great little thing. So, like, you get up in the morning, you want a cup of coffee, or you need to go find your shoes, or your child left their stuffy in the living room at bedtime, or you're just constantly going back and forth.
Yeah.
And it's tucked kind of at the edge of the woods, and so you just have like all it brings that, I was talking earlier about how much time it takes to make serendipity happen of experiencing encounters with wildlife
Yeah.
outdoors.
Yeah.
When you live like that, it changes that calculus and you start having a lot more encounters, especially at night. If you keep the lights down, you don't have a bunch of outdoor lights, and it can be a little scary. The woods are dark, even the path to the house is dark from the street. But so the wildlife comes in, and you might, trip over an armadillo or a coral snake, this
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
crazy Texas reptile that's the most venomous snake in North America. That's striped with red, yellow, and black stripes. Looks like an old 1970s truck or something. Really good, beautiful, beautiful creature that's not aggressive if you leave it alone, or the owls and that come into the trees, and big ones often, the coyotes that come up to the fence and whatnot. So
Yeah.
it's been it's kind of a more remarkable, outcome than I would have even anticipated doing this. And yeah, and just learning how, for all of us, even like my wife isn't necessarily, she's was always very interested in these kinds of spaces, but maybe not in like having snakes outside her bedroom door, right?
I was going to say, I'm not sure that's going to sell it to everyone. I mean, I personally quite like snakes, but I think there might be people that are like, oh my goodness, that's a step too far. But it's actually that, I mean, that's part of like almost, it's sort of almost been an experiment for you, hasn't it? Is just this like, actually, how do you integrate with the nature that's around you and coexist together in a sort of semi harmonious way as much as possible. And I think, I mean, you said like the coral snake is a great example because it's very highly venomous, but actually you said it's, it's quite sort of reclusive and it's not aggressive. And it's understanding that we have these fears, don't we, in sort of ingrained in our culture of certain animals and entities and things, and actually the reality of living with them can be quite different, and they're not quite as, you need to respect them, but they're not quite as scary as perhaps we initially think.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the first time you see them, I mean, like I see it with my daughter. We have a 5-year-old daughter, and we have like a lot of spiders in the house, and she does not like the spiders. And but sort of teaching her that, well, the spiders are, there's a mama wolf spider there, and yes, she has 100 little babies on her back, and she
Yeah.
doesn't want to mess with you. She just wants to take care of her babies. And
Yeah.
and even a young child can come to understand that, even when there's like a reflexive fear. And yeah, we're certainly all conditioned to know instinctively that some animals can harm us. And in a way, I think, experiencing that like, oh, yes, there are, you know, I, I'm not intrinsically superior in all contexts
Yeah.
to all other forms of life. Like the first time you encounter a coyote or a wolf out in the outdoors, And it sees you too. It's an intense experience to know, like, oh yeah, there are still other forms of life allowed to roam the planet, even in the city, that could um, theoretically at least use us as their food, right?
Yeah.
And experiencing that gets you much more in touch with your own true nature as a human, and it helps you connect with that wildlife maybe in a counterintuitive way. But yeah, the experiment of it, of inviting life in, it's not always perfectly successful, because it's all about finding balance, right? So we had one season where there's this millipede, this species of millipede that like lives in the leaf litter in this part of the country, in this part of the world, and they want to be dry, and they're nocturnal, and they want to eat all the time. And so we had a really rainy season after our green roof had really fully established itself, and it's full of leaf litter. It's full of like dead plant matter from the seasons before, and then we had like a month of rain in our dry climate, and suddenly
They thought
our
your house was
house
quite
was
good.
filled with millipedes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they couldn't find any food. It was like, they're like, it's great. It's dark at night. It's dry, whatever. But then there's no food. And then that was just like a nightmare. And so, but instead of like, putting a bunch of, pesticides out, we just figured out how to, reinforce maybe our little transoms and things like that where they could get in and work on the ecological balance and maybe take some of that, kind of rake some of that leaf litter food out a little more thoroughly. And,
Yeah, so
and
they're
sure
not quite.
enough,
Yeah.
yeah, within a season, that wasn't so much of a problem. So,
Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's sort of finding this balance, isn't it? And there will be things that happen. Like you said, that was a particularly wet season, so it created a problem that hadn't existed before, and perhaps won't exist again. And you just have to find your way. And I think that's kind of like what you do through your sort of description of the urban landscape as well, is like you have this true explorer mentality, I think, don't you? And you find your way through all of these places. Because I think when I think of, like, nature in the urban environment, I think a lot of people would think of, like, the sort of prescribed, green spaces that are left, the parks and
yeah.
that sort of thing. And it is what I love about your book and your story is actually, like, you almost say, like, they're sort of depletive of nature as well, and actually where you find the nature is in all of these sort of like edge zones and almost abandoned areas. And it's just a whole different way of looking at the urban landscape, which I think is really fascinating for people both outside of the urban landscape and also those that are in the urban landscape and want to find ways to reconnect with nature that is around them.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really astute observation. And because, yeah, I mean, I have found that most places in the city that are officially designated as parks, even though they may be green spaces, they're very attentively managed and they're
Yeah.
not really wild. And there's not a lot of other life there because the human activity is so intensive because people enjoy those parks. And I was inspired, like when I was young, like college age, I was very interested in, writers like the writers of British New Wave science fiction, like J.G. Ballard and M. John Harrison, and got turned on to the psychogeographers, all of these British writers who were talking about kind of, writing about walking and about walking as exploration and how to hack your experience of the city, drawing on, ideas that they had gotten from the French situationists and then took in other more kind of occult and very British directions, the Ian Sinclair types and Will
Yeah.
Self. And so, but they're all kind of like staying on the pavement, right?
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
sort of go out and they're like, oh, I'm going to like invert your way of saying the city, but they're not really ever, you know, getting their feet dirty, as it were, right? And so this is like, well, what happens if you step off the pavement and instead of going to the park, you go to that like space at the end of the road where there's, a patch of untended dirt. Or if you go under the overpass there out by the airport in that very Ballardian landscape and kind of see what's around. And you often find in those kinds of places, they're like exceptionally wild because they're, in some respects, at least, because they are keeping out a lot of the other human activity other than that infrastructural use. But there's not a lot of,
Yeah.
people roaming around on the ground, and they're almost like a kind of weird, like liminal secret commons,
Yeah.
and so finding that, and they exist all over the world. Whenever I travel, you can always find these places. I found them in London, I found them in Barcelona, I found them in Munich, I found them in Seoul. um, and it's just that they exist. They're just intrinsic because it's basically, there's always some piece of land that either for some reason, uh, whether permanently or temporarily, is not subject to intense human use.
Yeah.
And it may or may not have an owner. And if it has an owner, they may or may not be doing anything to care for it, i.e.,
Yeah.
mowing it and
Yeah.
coming in. And so those spaces are the places where nature is allowed to kind of do its own thing. It may be a mix of, native and invasive species that are, expressing in those places, but they're interesting. And it's very much like, you look at these, I mean, you think about the bombed out landscapes in Britain and Europe during World War II, and what people found was, like, very quickly wild plants would, like, find their way to those spots and, like, kind of appear.
Yeah.
And I don't know. And when that happens, it's beautiful. Or, like, one more example to this, British writer Richard Deacon in the 1850s wrote this book about the flora of the Colosseum of Rome.
Oh
And
wow.
this is kind of flashing us back 170 years or whatever. But here was this urban ruin, right?
Yeah.
Of, what to the Romans would have been like post-apocalyptic by their standards, right?
Yeah.
This ruined building. And he found that it was just this, because it had been kind of left alone, right? It was this astonishing repository of biodiversity, not just of plants from the Italian landscape, but also plants from Africa
Oh wow.
that
Yeah.
he
I guess
surmised
brought
had
in.
kind of
Yeah.
like come in on the, in the hair of the animals that had been,
Yeah.
brought to fight in the games. So there are contemporary exemplars of that kind of thing all over the place. They're just kind of hiding in plain sight.
I think the big thing is that it's about sort of getting intentional, isn't it? With like becoming aware of what's around you and not, I mean, you talk at one point in your book about how actually how we move through the urban landscape is very controlled by, the structure and, the planners and everything like that. And actually, part of it is becoming intentional, being aware of actually how your movement is being shaped, and the fact that you think you've got freedom of movement and choice, and actually you're quite clearly sort of shepherded to follow certain routes, and becoming intentional and aware of what's around you and how you can step, like you said earlier, step off the pavement
Yeah.
and start exploring.
Yeah, think of the entire city as, a potential desire path to be to be blazed on your own initiative. Subject to the laws of trespass. But yeah, I mean, I think it's right. I mean, to me, we think, like, when we're young and we're first allowed to kind of roam free from parental oversight, the city just seems like a zone of unlimited liberty. And maybe to some extent, as children, or as young people, as adolescents, maybe it is
Yeah.
to a certain extent, or as college students or whatever. But as adults, yeah, I mean, the city is really a labyrinth of enclosure and access control.
Yeah.
Especially in the contemporary. I mean, where it's just like everywhere we go, there's some kind of now electronic mode of control and surveillance, and it's not just like electronic surveillance, just the human surveillance, right? Just like we're all socially controlled by
Yeah.
the constant gaze of others in the urban landscape. And I think having moments of escape from that is a big part of this sort of the psychology of why we seek moments of solitude in nature as a
Yeah.
kind of refuge. But one of the things I talk about in the book is how that, when that to me, one of the things I've learned over the course of my own explorations is that you know, the idea of solitude in nature is a kind of a big lie in a way,
Yeah.
because what you find is it's not solitude. It's like a much more inclusive idea of connection with other life, unmediated by language. And it's just like that when you get to feel like all the other life around you. And so when you can find spots in the city that let you do that, and the half hour you might have free for such an exploration,
Yeah.
it can really, to me, provide a very meaningful respite and like restorative, authentic experience of real life that you can take with you as you go about what you have to do to get by in a society that wants us all busy feeding the machine.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, that's a big thing for my podcast. Is I obviously called it Nurtured by Nature, and it was this sort of dual aspect of how nature can nurture us, and that sort of healing space, that opportunity to step outside of the busyness and the like constant sort of hamster wheel that society has us on. But on the other side is how we can nurture nature. And I think, I mean, it's why your book here, I think I love so much, is because you cover both of those camps basically of how nature has become this intrinsic part of your life and your experience, and helped you through difficult times, and had amazing memories that you've created with your family, and helped with you know pressures and experiences that you've had. And then on the other side of it, you found your way into like how actually you can partner with nature and in building your home and caring for these areas. And it's gone beyond your home. I think that's what's really, as you move sort of through the book, it's like initially you're sort of about your journey, but it's also how you start becoming involved in your local community and supporting sort of community action, looking how to support the wildlife in the wild areas and how you can protect them um moving forward
Yeah.
as yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was really interesting for me. I mean, one, how to your point, and we can circle back on this, you get out in these pockets of wild urban nature and you see this paradox of witnessing the damage we have
Yeah.
inflicted upon the earth, and at the same time the beauty of nature's resilience and capacity to
Yeah.
endure and to express itself in a way that's sort of prone to emotional bursts of landscape romance even in the ugly places. um, and you come to learn over time how, oh, like that damage you see in the world around you, in the natural world around you, is a mirror of the kind of the damage we can all feel, I think,
Yeah.
in ourselves, in a way that even if we're not the victims of particularly extraordinary traumas, that we're made to live in many ways against our nature to
Yeah.
feed
Yeah.
this machine, which is really all about, at its root, the sort of extraction of surplus from nature, starting with grain agriculture and all the way to whatever cryptocurrency or whatever, to
Yeah. Yeah.
feed the human population and create wealth. And so, but and then you find, like I found with my lot, I sort of go, oh, here's this empty lot. This is kind of cool. I sort of saw it from the view from nowhere that critical studies people sometimes talk about. Sort of this decontextualized, like kind of the guy from Iowa walking into the brutalized landscape. I'm like, oh, this is neat. I can
Yeah.
make a little house here. And then I'm like, oh, this pipeline came from, I mean, one, like the reason this is here is because of like Jim Crow area industrial zoning,
Yeah.
down zoning, and the sort of segregation of people of color into the part of town where I found myself, although I wasn't in a heavily residential area, right? I wasn't
Yeah.
sort of displacing anybody per se by taking over this empty lot.
Yeah.
It definitely was that part of town, which had been sort of legally desegregated, but not functionally
Yeah.
really.
Yeah.
And the pipeline came from this above ground petroleum storage tank farm. You know, those big
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
barrel like depots that uh, had been run by five major oil companies, but badly maintained, and it was leaking benzene and other really nasty toxic petrochemicals into the
Yeah.
soil, and literally killing families that were like living behind it with all, you know, all sorts of cancers and other
Yeah.
illnesses. Children and elderly in particular were impacted. And so I found out that like some of my neighbors had led a fight, you know, 15, 20 years before I got there to, um, you know, fight against the environmental racism that was embodied in that, to fight for the environmental justice at the intersection of, you know, racial, social, and
Yeah.
economic justice. And you sort of, and then I found out working with them on some stuff as I got to know, like, oh, this is convenient. We have this sort of establishment lawyer guys moved into the
Yeah.
neighborhood, and he kind of gets it, and so we were able to work together to try to, you know, take on some new things. Everything from, you know, the little you know, rich local guys who want to develop a hotel in the natural space, not the worst outcome, to things like Tesla, which during COVID lockdown built this gigantic gigafactory, you know, that sort of like I've never seen anything that big go up that fast unless it was done by a nation state. Just like an
Wow.
astonishing, like
Yeah.
sudden, like unearthly presence in the land. And again, there on a site that had been, you know, pretty blighted. It was like a giant gravel pit, you know, a sort
Okay.
of you know, place to make concrete, but still on this beautiful urban river. And so we were able to organize to, you know, work with them to, you know, ensure that they did the work to kind of help restore the riparian and maintain the natural character of the riparian portion of the land, and also to attend to some of the, you know, labor and equity issues around that project. And so yeah, you for me at least, digging into these kinds of projects, I really came to much better appreciate how much the social and economic injustices that we're often preoccupied with in our contemporary politics
Yeah.
are really deeply intertwined with the damaged relationship we have with the land on which we live, you know,
Yeah.
including, you know, I mean, one, it's about the things we do to take from nature, and then the things we do to uh, coerce or force others to help us do so, you know, and, you know, we're all,
It's that all that exploitive, sort of hierarchy, isn't it? And it's like, if if you're able to, if you're buying into exploiting nature, you're quite, it's not much of a step to therefore exploit other humans, sadly, as well. And they are very like interlinked. And I mean, it is something that I've really spoken to quite a lot of guests about this year. And it's like, that you can't separate one from the other. Like, actually, that's one of the beauties of when you start looking at how you can really sort of step back into this relationship with nature and caring for nature. It's actually, it has this ripple effect of like, you have to start caring for people as well, and bringing them online. And it's fantastic to hear that you've been involved with supporting people who, you found yourself in a region of the city that is really normally marginalized, and that therefore is marginalized people that are also there, and how you've been able to use your experience and knowledge to in support of them.
yeah, it's been really reaffirming. And then, you know, and then you have like your clueless Iowa boy revelations of things like realizing how many of your neighbors are the descendants of indigenous inhabitants of this continent, right? And just like,
Yeah.
and that sort of opens up all other territories of understanding the like layers of deep history and histories of colonization that are manifest around you, and the just very commonplace fabric of everyday life, and how much it is about controlling the land to, you know, create wealth for the population and really for the few, and that, you know, we're all the descendants of agricultural laborers at some point, right?
Yeah.
And you know, and undoing that kind of relationship with the land I don't know, is an important undertaking.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of times that your background, well, you've got quite an interesting background because you're on the surface you're a lawyer, which you do touch on quite a bit in your book, and also you've just mentioned now as there are areas where the law kind of lets nature down, doesn't it? In terms of like, we have this notion of ownership, I guess, of nature. And one of the things that you mentioned right towards the end is this progression towards rights of nature that we're now seeing and is taking hold of people having like um, or sort of entities like rivers being given personship and rights to exist and things, which is a really interesting sort of branch for the future, isn't it? Of like actually where the legal framework is now sort of coming into place where we can use that to support nature, because prior to that it's been fairly lacking, hasn't it? I mean, you mention it in your book of how law has evolved to basically have ownership of nature.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the law doesn't really recognize objects in nature other than as objects of unless they have except as human property or as
Yeah,
things that could become human property. And yeah, and this rights of nature movement, the idea to use kind of principles of contemporary Anglo-American common law or European civil law as the means to tackle the idea that as the American legal scholar Richard Stone, provocatively asked his students one day in 1969, if corporations can have rights, why can't trees? That like if
yeah,
you can take a fictional being that's entirely a creation of the law and give them legal personhood, surely you can do that with a plant or an animal in the same way as we do all the time with people that are humans that are deemed not to have legal capacity,
yeah,
like
yeah,
children and invalids, right? And so and it's actually, I think, the subject of Robert McFarlane's forthcoming book is all about this rights of nature movement. And I've been this year reading with great fascination and excitement about this new law in the UK on biodiversity net gain. The
yeah,
idea that
yeah,
that any new real estate project of any significance has to demonstrate a 10% increase in biodiversity following the project. And I'm actually working on a piece about how that's an idea we need to steal over here, because that's a much more practical way and a much more, I think, immediately impactful way than these kinds of rights of nature movements, which are, I think, going to take a lot longer for the law to really evolve to be able to recognize. But I think inevitably that will start happening because it just makes intrinsic sense from a
yeah,
kind of jurisprudential point of view. And once the sort of first big cases land that conclude that yes, Happy the elephant in the Bronx Zoo is entitled to habeas corpus, or yes,
yeah.
that riparian ecosystem is entitled to some kind of legal protection, then that's going to really change things. And yeah, so we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, it's a new, it's still quite in its infancy, but it's something to sort of be hopeful that it gives us that framework for the future that, like you say, can be tested with law and, hopefully give us opportunities to shape things in a much better manner. But the other side of what you do, because this you are an author already, but you write science fiction. And so this is a bit of a step away in some respects. But I was wondering if you found like that sort of creativity that you have to write science fiction, the way that you sort of view and explore through that science fiction of, I guess parallel experiences and things, whether that you find that's actually been quite helpful in sort of how you've moved through, sort of looking at ways that you can like reimagine how society can interact with nature in a much more sort of positive manner than we have in the last sort of few hundred years.
Yeah, absolutely. I've mostly my three novels are all kind of literary dystopias, right? And so they undertake that thing that dystopian literature does of putting a kind of dark mirror, dark funhouse mirror up to the real world, trying to like take material from the observed world and change the mixture and how you portray it in order to emphasize things that are, things you think people should pay more attention to understand how we can make the world better, right?
Yeah.
A sort
Yeah.
of dystopia that's trying to like use speculative counterfactuals to help people see the world through a slightly different lens and maybe imagine their way to something more like utopia. And so while I was working on these books, which initially I often was setting out to write something very political and, sort of neo Orwellian, if you will, um, I found that like, oh, kind of to what we were talking about earlier, like you can't deal with, creating a more authentically participatory democracy, or, you can't, have a sort of, popular change in your speculative laboratory without dealing with the damaged relationship these characters have with the land on which they live. That it was
Yeah.
all tied up. And I was working on these projects in parallel, which in a way were sort of like variant, like an applied science fiction experiment of taking the kind of story idea, the narrative idea that the British science, the English science fiction writer Brian Aldiss coined of the cozy catastrophe. And sort of, there's a lot of these English or British novels from after World War II about, you know, a small group of middle class people holed up at the abandoned Ritz Hotel
Yeah.
while everything goes to hell outside and the dinosaurs are coming back, or the
Yeah.
plants have all turned into, sentient zombies that are taking over the landscape or whatever. And that there's like a romance to that, or to like the post-apocalyptic stories,
Yeah.
right? These
Yeah.
end of the world fictions that we're all, I think, kind of attracted to. I started to realize like, oh, it's, yeah, we say they're warnings or whatever, right? But they're really expressing also our sort of latent yearning for the rewilded world that could
Yeah.
be, for like,
The end of the world as we know it, but not the end of the world kind of thing.
right, we want
Yeah.
to, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, we want to see the city covered in foliage because that's kind
Yeah.
of what the world wants in a way.
Yeah.
And so I joked with an English writer friend of mine when I was sending them my galleys that, I always wanted to write a cozy catastrophe. I didn't know it was going to have to be nonfiction, right?
Yeah.
But and so you circle back to kind of where we started. What I realized is like, yes, that post-apocalyptic aesthetic is expressing this yearning, but it doesn't have to be some kind of after us,
Yeah.
depopulated future. To the contrary, that's a really creepy way to be thinking about things. That leads to kinds of, it's not an accident that people have rightly, derided some of those kinds of thinkings as eco-fascist, almost, of like,
Yeah.
like, oh, we got to get rid of all the people. It's like, no, we need to figure out.
It's kind of
um
lazy in a way as well, I think. It's like, this kind of it's like it's almost an excuse to do nothing, actually, isn't it? It's like, well, we just need to wipe ourselves out, but until that point we can just carry on with business as normal. And it's sort of, it doesn't actually encourage you to do like what your book is encouraging people to do, which is to think of your current life and how you can change that and change your current experience to become more encompassing of nature and the world around you, and therefore create a brighter future rather than just sort of being like, well, it's all going to end badly, so I just don't need to bother.
Absolutely. And when you undertake these kinds of projects, which can be really small, like this writer friend of mine has rewilded a little patch of dirt under the elevated M train in Queens,
Yeah.
in the outer boroughs of New York. Or really huge projects like the restoration of the Isar River in Munich or things like that. Um, those kinds of projects can give you a sense of agency
Yeah.
in our climate future, a kind of maybe not the cure, but certainly a palliative for eco grief.
Yeah.
A sense that like it doesn't, you don't have to wait around for global institutions to do something about the climate crisis or to do something about the part of the environmental crisis that I think gets less attention in a way, which is the biodiversity crisis.
Yeah.
The fact that according to the World Wildlife Fund, the wildlife population of the planet has plummeted by 69%
Yeah.
since 1970.
Yeah.
And you just like think about it. And like, it's like, yeah, that is, and you can't even, you can't argue with the science of that fact in the way that some people think they can argue about warming,
Yeah.
planetary warming. And so just like, yeah, you can with whatever, whether it's your, apartment balcony or, some little shared community plot or a little bit of guerrilla gardening down by the river, or if you are lucky enough to have a single family home or a duplex or whatever and a yard or garden to tend to, or to organize with your neighbors to do something on a more, on a wider communal scale. We all have the ability to, rewild the future in a way that includes us and lets
Yeah.
us enjoy some of the richness of the world that we can have around us.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that some of like you talk, I think earlier in your book about, most of the landscapes have, that we sort of think we're trying to return nature to. Like humans have been a part of that natural evolution for so long. Like we just have to, remember that we can be a keystone species for good in that relationship. And actually, working locally, I think, is really, really so important. And like you said, there's some great organizations. I had a fantastic guest a little while ago, what's Shuba Ali of Garden for Wildlife, and they're just huge about, like, encouraging people to plant native plants. They've got lots of amazing resources for people in America that they can, tap into to find what plants are native for their area. And it is these little things that we can all do that become cumulative, don't they? And it can make a real difference for the future. And like you mentioned, that gives us this sense of actually being able to do something when we look around us and we see like the damage that's been done, and we feel the pain and the grief from that. And actually, by being active, becoming involved in these sort of community projects if we can, or doing a little bit ourselves, in if we've got a garden or we've got a window box or whatever it might be,
Right.
is kind of the cure to that. And it helps us emotionally and mentally and physically quite often. And it also helps with, like you said, the biodiversity crisis, and helping, at least maybe stop where, the route that we're going down, and then maybe we can, get things stopped and then look where we can go instead.
Yeah. I mean, it never ceases to amaze me how quickly nature responds to those kinds of invitations.
Yeah.
Even, I mean, I did it. I started doing it on like an apartment balcony, right? With like some planters, right?
Yeah.
And evolved to do it with my whole house and now like my entire part of town. And I saw it. My parents did it in a rural area when I was in college. They bought this like blighted agricultural acreage, and all they ever did was just burn it. They
Yeah.
used like controlled burns, and very quickly, like the land exhibits this incredible memory and just like life that's like literally in its repository and ready to come back. And it's kind of just wondrous every time. And yeah, even in the urban landscape, if it's just, a few people start doing it, you create this archipelago of restoration.
Yeah.
And it really does help counter what's a scary direction we've been on, and help us kind of get back on a healthier path and
Oh,
feel
well,
good in the process.
yeah, it's been amazing talking to you, Chris. I would encourage, your book is out now, so everyone can go and grab themselves a copy. It's A Natural History of Empty Lots, and I'll have links in the podcast description, so people can find out more about you, follow you on social media, and find your book. But is there anything that you would like to leave people with, from your experience, from your journey, just a last message for people before we wrap up today?
I would just say, try to go outside, step off the pavement, and get a little lost if it's not too scary for you, and see what you might find.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, definitely step off the pavement and just change how you view the world, basically.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Chris. It's really been a pleasure to speak to you, and I hope everyone goes and grabs a copy of your book, and I'd love to hear from people who've read it and how much they've enjoyed it. So yeah, but it's been fantastic, and maybe we'll speak again in the future.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Fiona. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to the Nurtured by Nature podcast. I truly hope this conversation has brought some hope and inspiration into your life. I would love to have these messages ripple out across the world. So if you can, please share this episode with your friends, leave a review on your favourite podcast player, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. I would love to hear from you, so please feel free to connect with me on the links provided in the podcast description. But most importantly, thank you so much for being a part of this journey with me. But don't forget to simply get out there and enjoy the natural world.